The Chronicles of Narnia is not a Christian allegory. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Sometimes it even grates on me a little bit. And then worse yet, the people who say it usually assume it's one of those obvious and undisputable facts, which is even worse. In this video, I'm going to make the point that calling Narnia a Christian allegory is unhelpful and not particularly true in any unique way. I think that idea reflects either, one, the absence of a robust view of allegory, or two, a lack of a robust familiarity with Narnia. Or maybe even more so, third option, the absence of a robust view just of what good fiction just in general actually is. I think that that statement that the Chronicles of Narnia is a Christian allegory, I think it leads to a kind of misunderstanding that undersells the artistic quality and storytelling finesse that C.S. Lewis put into his Narnia stories, while also tragically relegating them to a place of irrelevance and boringness for those who aren't currently focused on religious studies. But that statement just isn't true. At least that's what I'm going to argue. I think rather than putting Narnia into the box with dumbed down Christian theology for kids, I think it makes more sense to put Narnia into the box with classic fantasy literature from the 1950s. Classic fiction with enough quality of thought and enough imaginative storytelling to hold the attention of thoughtful adults such as myself. I think if someone picks up The Magician's Nephew today, in 2024, they pick up that book and they find it boring, I think it won't be because it's all just Christian theology dumbed down for kids, and that's why it's so boring. I think rather it could possibly seem boring to a lot of people because it's a classic book from the 1950s. So it's got that slower and more thoughtful pace, as well as the older style of language. And it's also got this intentionally small vocabulary so that very young readers in the 1950s could follow it. Smaller vocabulary, but also kind of that quirky British 1950s vocabulary, which can be a little fun in its own way. But anyway, none of that being just because it's simply nothing but a Christian allegory. All right, so that's my conclusion. Now let me go ahead and try to make my case. So first, let's think a little bit about what an allegory is. Let's kind of do some definition work here. So an allegory has been defined as an extended metaphor. I like that definition because it's so short and concise. Good simplified definition. An allegory is an extended metaphor. So if we could say a metaphor would be something like when you say that your computer is a beast, rather than saying your computer is a very good piece of technology, or saying that your computer is like a, powerful animal. Instead, you just say, my computer is a beast. So then an extended metaphor would be to make a longer version of that. If you were to say, hey there, let me tell you a story. There was this beast walking around along the road named Mac OS 14. And on the other side of the road, there was a decrepit dinosaur named Patty Cake, and all his friends called him PC for short. Mac the Beast was always running along. Anywhere he went, he would run. He never even so much as stumbled as he ran. But the poor old dinosaur would always get up off the ground and try to run, and he would crash. He would crash just because he hit a bug. He would crash when he hit a worm. And these big giant Trojan horses were always grabbing at him. The old dinosaur is still alive today, but it's only because Mac and all his best friends took it upon themselves to graciously eat up all the bugs and worms and the big giant Trojans, so that the Patty Cake, the hobbling hadrosaur, wouldn't go extinct. But the hobbling hadrosaur continues to hobble, even without any worms to come after him, and his end is near. So that's my little extended metaphor I threw together based on the idea that, your computer is a beast. Now, if I were to ask you what the story is about, but you're not allowed to say anything about computers, well, you wouldn't have a whole lot to say, because that's all it is. The allegory isn't about the surface terms. Those are just figures of speech for the real referent, which is to say, the reign of the PC is coming to an end, and it's just, taking all of its seeming goodness is just coming from what it's stealing from the Apple world, something like that. So that's the allegory isn't about the surface terms, because those are just figures of speech for the real referent. The things on the surface are only there to tell the real story going on behind it. Now, in that case, because it was something that I just threw together really quick, it doesn't have a really to the point I didn't craft it like a real allegory would be crafted, so that there's more intentionality and meaning to what it's saying about computers in that case. So here's a definition from Merriam-Webster that I got from their website. It says an allegory is, quote, the expression by means of symbolic fictional figures and actions of, the expression of, truths or generalizations about human existence. And then it has, or it could be an instance of such an expression, as in a story or a painting. So it's the expression by means of symbolic stuff of truths or generalizations. And I think a little bit of comparison would help a little bit here. So let's think about a classic example of actual Christian allegory, probably one of the most well-known long-form allegories just in general. This was the 17th century publication called The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to That Which Is to Come, delivered under the similitude of a dream, originally published in 1678. And yeah, back then they just always had long titles like that. We can just call it Pilgrim's Progress for short. Now, probably part of the reason that the author of this book used allegory probably has something to do with the fact that he was currently in prison for preaching without a license, without getting a license from the Anglican State Church, which they wouldn't give him because of his theology. After all, it's harder to get in trouble for publishing some weird old story about some guy taking a road trip than it is to get in trouble for writing theology books that disagree with the established church. And needless to say, people just gobbled up the Pilgrim's Progress. But as far as stories go, the story wasn't actually that much of a story by story standards. The pilgrim of the story, whose name is Christian, what an odd name. He goes on this journey to find the celestial city and meets people along the way with names like Hopeful, who is hopeful of finding the city, and names like Obstinate, who is obstinate, or the threesome that he sees napping along the side of the road, whose names are Simple, Sloth, and Presumption. Or this other threesome who ended up causing some political trouble for our characters later on in the story, Envy, Superstition, and Pickthank. This is the 17th century after all. Can't have all the words making easy sense for us modern people. And then in the early part of the book, the big bad villains, two of the big bad villains were Giant Despair and Apollyon, which is a traditional synonym for the devil. And then book 2 focuses on Christian's wife, Christiana. Yeah, that's right. It's just Christian with an A on the end. So needless to say, most of the dilemmas and conflicts that Christian or Christiana face would be, seen as a story per se, would be fairly unremarkable, dull, poorly developed, and two-dimensional if viewed as a piece of storytelling that's focusing on an epic journey with various characters as the focus, because the surface is just a veneer, just the language and the figures of speech that Bunyan is using for his extended metaphor, which is primary, not secondary. The metaphor is primary, not secondary to what's being written. Kind of like the word dinosaur, when you say that the PC is a dinosaur. It's not serving to talk about all the different hadrosaurs and tyrannosaurs that are out there. It's talking about the computer in the story and what it's saying about that. So if you're not interested in Christian theology or Christian living or that kind of thing, then Bunyan's stories there probably won't hold a lot of interest, because they're not actually about how travelers are going to survive on a very long foot journey toward a far off city. That's not what they're about at all. Every single character, every single scene, every single line of dialogue, and every single narrator's comment is specifically referring to some particular aspect of Christian living or Christian theology. And as such, it's great spiritual meditative reading for Christians, but it's not supposed to be good fiction or quality storytelling in the ordinary sense. By way of contrast, let's think about Narnia. First off, let's just take a glance at the map of Narnia, which, at least in the paperbacks that I read as a kid, these were usually included in the front of the book. You get different maps in different books, depending how zoomed in you want to be, depending on the focus of the particular book. But right off the bat, you might be wondering, since Narnia is an allegory, you might be wondering what the various places and names and locations mean, allegorically in Narnia world. Well, here's what they all mean. This is Narnia. This is where the Narnia stories take place. These are the locations where things happen, and also where the back history of Narnia all unfolded. That's it. Archenland isn't an allegory for Italy. it's Archenland. The Lone Islands aren't Hawaii, and neither Archenland nor the Lone Islands are, let's say, the faithful Christian life or something abstract like that. Archenland is Archenland because it's the border country between Narnia and Calormen. That's what its identity is all about. And the reason it's placed between Narnia and Calormen, well, it's because when travelers like Bree and Shasta in The Horse and His Boy, when they had to cross Archenland to get to Narnia, as they were running and trying to escape the oppressive land to the south. And I guess maybe the real significance of Archenland might be the fact that this is the place where when Shasta and the group made it to Archenland, they ended up finding out there in Archenland. That was where they found out that the king of Archenland was Shasta's biological father. So in a flash of a moment, following all the fear and despair, trying to get away from these people pursuing them, suddenly Shasta was given this new kind of hope and belonging and family identity that reversed everything he thought he knew about himself. He escaped slavery, abuse, mistreatment, and fear. And then he found out, suddenly in Archenland, he found out that his sense of unworthiness was actually to be paired with a deeper identity and a deeper kind of connection than he ever could have dreamed of. That's what Archenland means. It's not an allegory. It's a deeply meaningful story about people that C.S. Lewis imagined, and we can all imagine too. So that's my first bit of my argument for why Narnia is not an allegory. Just take a glance at one of the maps, and Narnia is clearly much more than an allegory. It's a work of fiction. It's fantasy. It's a great big story in a universe that C.S. Lewis made up out of thin air, but which feels strikingly meaningful on a deeply human level. My second argument is the simple fact that Narnia stories tend to actually be invalid and very incomplete if taken as point-by-point theological metaphors. To illustrate this, let's just take the most grossly obvious, I would suggest in an unfortunate way, the most grossly obvious metaphor in the books of the death of Aslan on the cross, or pardon me, on the stone table. Definitely an allegorical element in that sense, if you want to think of it that way. But I think most Christian theologians would agree that taken as an actual full and proper point-by-point allegory, this actually would end up telling an odd and even an aberrant version of the crucifixion story. It would be something like Jesus offered himself to Satan as part of a deal with the devil to save one person who wouldn't have needed saving except for one recent decision that he made to try to get even with certain other people who didn't need to be saved. But Jesus had a trick up his sleeve when he made a deal with the devil, and he was able to pull one over on Satan using his greater knowledge about the laws of the universe. Then later in Prince Caspian, we find out that the site of the cross, or the stone table, was built into a sacred monument after everything happened, kind of like there was this memorial church with the stone table or the cross at its center. Let's just say this isn't much in terms of an extended metaphor. Metaphor, yes, Aslan died on the cross. But extended metaphor, things just get weirder and weirder the harder you look at it. And then let's think about the multitudinous references to our universe within the Narnia stories. The Telmarines in Prince Caspian, for example, were pirates, if I remember right, from our world who slipped through a crack between the universes and ended up forming the ruling class of Narnia for an extended period of time. And then at the end of Dawn Treader, or was it Silverchair? I'm actually not sure. And I was going to double check that, but I forgot. And I just have a question mark in my notes here. But whichever one it was, Aslan tells the children, the main characters, because all the characters are children. So I suppose if you don't like children at all, you won't like the Narnia books. But Aslan tells the children that he exists in our world by a different name, meaning that in these stories, Aslan isn't supposed to be an allegorical referent for Jesus, so that every time you see the word Aslan, this is symbolically talking about our world and it's actually Jesus. No, instead, Aslan is something that C.S. Lewis has fantasized into existence for a fantasized world that we may all imagine. Not an allegorical set of symbolism for our world or for Christian theology, but instead an imagined fantasy universe that we can imagine to exist alongside our world with its own history and its own set of fictional realities. And most importantly, in The Magician's Nephew, the children discover an entire network of universes connected together at the wood between the worlds. And one of those worlds is our universe. I don't think we should say that the point of that would be that Lewis believes in multiple universes, something which, if I remember correctly from what I've heard, Lewis has implied that he's open to that idea because he's one of those kinds of people that's open to a lot of things that we can't disprove, but certainly not something he believes in at all. But what it is simply a thrilling, delightful fantasy element that forms a central part to the Narnia lore, and which every child like me, when I was a kid, every child like me who read those stories just bubbles up, not because it has some allegorical referent, but because this is the stuff that the Narnia universe is made out of. Often people talk as though there's ordinary fiction that we're all familiar with through all the books we read and movies we watch and all that. There's ordinary fiction that we're all familiar with. And then there are allegories like Narnia. I would suggest it's the other way around. Narnia is only as allegorical as normal, high-quality literature or film, such as the kind that we are surrounded with. The exception to that maybe would be something like the overly obvious Aslan dying on a cross bit. Whereas Pilgrim's Progress shows us a highly symbolic, kind of sermon-esque allegory, Narnia instead tells us a story that is primarily its own extended universe and extended fiction that Lewis created out of his own inner delight for fantasy and imagination. But along the way, he made the kinds of points that any good literary work will make, drawing on parallels with things that he was interested in, which is what every good literary work, every good literary creator does. And for C.S. Lewis, because of who he was, the things that he made reference to and drew parallels with were specifically Christian theology and philosophy. Similarly, Stan Lee made certain points in his Spider-Man comics, points about morality and the ordinary life. And you could very legitimately, you could view Spider-Man, the comics, and I'm thinking as well of the 2003 or whenever it was, the Tobey Maguire series of films. You could think of the Spider-Man story legitimately as a coming-of-age story wrapped in the garb of the supernormal, in which the teenage everyman, which is basically what Peter Parker is, maybe a little on the nerd side of everyman, a story in which the teenage everyman finds himself growing out of his awkward stage, because we all go through an awkward stage when we're in our early teens, or especially when you're at that growth spurt area where you're just kind of disoriented and weird and trying to figure out how to try to be normal. So he finds himself growing out of that awkward stage and finding himself with new skills and talents that some girls find attractive. And Stan Lee makes the point through his stories that Parker must choose whether to use his new self for good or for ill, which is a metaphor for the teenage everyman who may be reading the comics or watching the movie, and who will, as he grows into his new self, he will very soon have to make the exact same decisions in regard to his newfound self. Similarly, to take another popular franchise, or popular set of stories that have a franchise surrounding them, the early Star Wars films portrayed some very obvious space Nazis who are obviously Nazis. And it's full of plenty of talk about metaphysical dualism, moral influence, moral change, and mental discipline, all shaped by Lucas's interest in Buddhist philosophy. But we don't tend to understand Star Wars as any kind of allegory per se. Rather, we just think of it as a story that draws on images and ideas that the authors are familiar with, making some very intentional points along the way about morality, spirituality, mental discipline, and stuff like that. And most importantly, you can enjoy the story, whether or not you agree with the author's metaphysic, or even necessarily to all the finer points of his morality, let's say. Now, my next section here is just talking about Narnia in relation to the typical non-religious person, because I think that's where there can be a little bit of disconnect, which I don't think is necessary. I think, first off, one of the significant implications of all the stuff I just talked about above is that the fact that Narnia isn't just for Christians or for people who are open to Christianity, in contrast to, let's say, the Pilgrim's Progress. Rather, it's a coherent, in-universe story that is just plain a lot of fun and speaks to a lot of aspects of human life, drawing on universal themes of human experience, psychological character journeys, and thoughtful observations about the nature of the world around us. And as a side note on that topic, it's worth remembering that C.S. Lewis was a professor of literature with a very serious hobby in the study of philosophy, which makes him an intriguing individual worth listening to, even if you don't share his central faith convictions. His writings are, if nothing else, thought-provoking and built on a sturdy exposure to and a fascination with the literary classics. I also want to suggest that because Narnia is not a proper allegory per se, but rather an in-universe story with conscious analogs to the real world, because of that, often the spiritual metaphors that are there can be interpreted in a way that resonates with those who don't share his Christian convictions. So, for example, the melting of the witch's winter in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, this isn't my favorite book. I don't think it's one of the series' best offerings, but it is the most explicitly Christian to outsiders just because of that Aslan stone table part. So I think that makes this book a particularly good one to bring up for an example. So the melting of the winter is a very interesting and vivid metaphor for the inbreaking of the kingdom of Jesus spoken of in the New Testament, which most theologians will refer to as already not yet, already/not yet. The already aspect would be the one that started with Jesus's first coming, the not yet part that is in connection with Jesus's future second coming. So the changing of seasons in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the part where the seasons begin to change, the springtime starts to break through, the melting of snow and ice and the springing to life from deadness, while everyone can see the witch's power is slowly beginning to weaken. Seems to be something of a metaphor for the spreading of new life, spiritual new life, either in this age, that would be the already part, the spreading of new life in this age through the permeating of the teachings of Jesus and the Spirit of Jesus, or you could take it for the not yet part, for the new age that comes in Christian theology is supposed to come after darkness in our world has advanced to the point of making our world irrecoverable, leading to the folding together of our universe and the dawn of a new universe ruled by Jesus and serving functionally as the long-awaited return to Eden and the culmination of our inner longings for the rule of perfect justice and global peace in a harmonious universe. So that kind of big picture that C.S. Lewis would have had in his mind, because that's just basic Christian theology, what we might call the great hope of the gospel, that kind of thing. So that big picture is almost certainly something that Lewis was intentionally or not reflecting in his story when he said, Aslan is on the move and the witch's power is beginning to weaken. And we see that by springtime beginning to come from this frozen, icy wasteland. But while Christians will find this metaphor compelling and may take it as a reminder of the current inbreaking kingdom or the final coming kingdom of Jesus, but the reader isn't told any of that. None of that is a required interpretation. The reader is only presented with the change of seasons as a beautiful source of excitement and hope, reflecting the end of a reign of oppression and darkness and the dawn of the reign of light and hope. Now, while the change of seasons as a spiritual symbol, you could argue it's much more prominent in ancient polytheistic religions than it is in Christian thought. So on the surface, it wouldn't seem to be a very Christian idea in the first place. But the reason that it actually serves its purpose very naturally in the story here is because Jesus and the apostles described the beginning of faith in somebody coming to believe in Jesus, converting to the Christian faith, as it were. That was described as a transition from death, from an extended period of death, which is where we all naturally are under the power of Satan, as it were. Transition from death to new life, or metaphorically, resurrection or a rebirth, being born again, that idea. Since the beginning of the spring season is like a rebirth of plant life. It's a rebirth of, all these dead trees start to come back to life. It's the end of all the cold and the snow and the ice, which we kind of associate with death, because you kind of lose your life if you sit in the ice for too long, without getting shelter. So because of that, because there's this death to life aspect in the changing of seasons, that actually makes it an apt metaphor. But for those without a Christian conviction, there are plenty of other possible other things to hold as a compelling referent for this image that he's giving us. Possible other things that you might take as a referent for the universal metaphor of death and life, because that's all we've got here. We've got here is the seasons change, and that's like life and light coming into death and darkness. And what else do we have that we might think of with the metaphor of death? Well, to name a few, major depression, complicated grief, existential despair, and post-traumatic distress. Each of those are often referred to by people who are experiencing them as something like dying and being dead. And emerging out of any of those experiences is something people often refer to as something that feels like they were dead and they came back to life. You could argue, just to think of the Christian part, the Christian theology use of those metaphors, you could say that the authors of the New Testament simply used universal human experiential metaphors that humans use. And the authors of the New Testament used those metaphors to describe what they saw to be the ultimate referent of this perceived human, when we think about the idea of seeming to be dead and seeming to be alive, and we apply it to all these things, you could argue that the New Testament authors were simply using that universal metaphor to describe what they saw to be the ultimate version of that, the ultimate occurrence, the most meaningful incidence of something that can be related to that. So C.S. Lewis in his Narnia books, therefore, is really using universal human metaphors to indirectly allude to something that he, along with the authors of the New Testament, sees to be the ultimate referent. But if the reader doesn't prefer to focus on that kind of thing, if he doesn't think that that is the most meaningful referent for that figure of speech, then you can just enjoy a story that's talking about emerging from darkness, emerging from death and oppression. The reader could, for example, think of the metaphor as being in relation to, for example, the ideological change that happens after an oppressive regime is defeated at the end of a world war. And then gradually over time, the ice of malicious, prejudicial ideologies, that ice slowly begins to melt. And deleterious philosophies are gradually replaced by a society that does not cause the same degree of harm and death and prejudicial abuse to the vulnerable. Now, the most obvious exception to this principle, that you can a lot of the time read some of these things without having to be, constantly thinking about Christian theology as being, the only thing that makes this compelling. The one exception to that might be, well, what about Aslan? You might say, well, who could Aslan be except Jesus? If I don't like Jesus, how could I enjoy reading Narnia? Well, while it is obviously the case that Aslan is obviously the most consistent source of explicitly spiritual, of an explicitly spiritual aspect of the messaging that goes into the Narnia stories, it's also the case that Aslan is, like Jesus, the embodiment of everything that is best in humanity. And then to Christian theologians, that would be because the way Christians would see it, the way we would see it, the good in humans is the quote unquote image of God that even the worst of human corruption hasn't been able to eliminate. So then Jesus, as the express image or the only true embodied expression of God, by definition, he would be the capital I ideal. He's the perfect human per se. So even if you don't believe in God, you can appreciate the standard-breaking, admiration-worthy image of Jesus or Aslan as the best of virtues, ideals, and goodness, regardless of what you think about Jesus as a person or as a religious figure or as something literal and real. You can think of him as the pinnacle of what a person could conceivably ever look like, the embodiment of those intangible perfections that seem to make the difference between malice and love, which seem to mark the surprising capacities that result in a world where individuals have acted in such a way that even in the year 2024, we still haven't ended up creating a nuclear holocaust. You don't have to believe in God to appreciate Aslan as the embodiment of everything that is good. as the author sees it, the author's picture of what goodness is. Just like you don't have to believe in a creator, let's say, to appreciate the beautiful image of Aslan padding along in the dark, empty world, singing the talking beasts into their joyful existence in The Magician's Nephew at the Birth of Narnia. And that being said, there's also certainly nothing wrong with when you disagree with something. There's still nothing wrong with getting a little exposure. Getting a little exposure, in this case, to Christian thought through a little bit of fun metaphorical theology. To paraphrase something Justin Martyr said in the 2nd century AD, Christians are kind of everywhere. So, there's that too. And then my next point here, Narnia as something that has made an impact on modern fantasy and fiction just in general, as a classic. I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that every significant work of fantasy today has had some amount of influence from particularly Narnia and Middle-earth. And I'm just throwing that in there because people always think of, Lewis and Tolkien together. But not to discount Narnia, which is not, I don't think, not something that we should think of as Lord of the Rings Junior. It's very much its own thing. But anyway, as a classic, you could say reading Narnia has at least the same value as other recent modern classics. Just for an example of some of the ways things kind of affect things, last time I read through, or rather listened through, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I suddenly realized how explicitly the Eustace character at the beginning of the book is pretty much identical to the Dudley character from the Harry Potter books. And so I went and I did a quick Google, went online and asked Master Google if I was onto something. And while I didn't find any explicit evidence that that was a conscious thing where Rowling tried to adapt the character and made up Dudley intentionally, what I did find was a comment on the Wikipedia page that indicated that other people have drawn that connection, and that Rowling has indicated that she was heavily influenced by the Narnia books when she created Narnia, or when she created the Potter series. So, in conclusion, Narnia is not a Christian allegory. It is a story, pure and simple, with a lot of intriguing points to make along the way. So that's it for this video. In later videos, I want to talk about how I think that the best of the Narnia series, and especially my personal favorites, which are The Silver Chair and The Magician's Nephew, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they stack up, as I see it, how they stack up really well as insightful and exciting reading, even now that I'm an adult, not just for nostalgia's sake, but also for its compelling characters, ideas, and insights. Now, definitely, it does definitely make faith-related points more frequently and more vividly than non-faith-related points, but it does this with a finesse and artistry that I think is worthy of attention. And in my opinion, it doesn't become preachy or excessively allegorical, shall we say, maybe with the exception of the stone table as being one of the parts that is a little too explicit for my taste. And generally speaking, just in general, I don't tend to prefer a wardrobe or Caspian, the land from the wardrobe or Prince Caspian, as the best representation of the Narnia series. They were the first ones he wrote, and I think his ability to create something really powerful and compelling, I think that's best seen in some of his later works, which for me, my favorites are The Magician's Nephew and The Silver Chair. And I think the best place for a first-timer to start, because it's the first chronological story, is The Magician's Nephew. But that's my opinion, probably not necessarily the most popular opinion out there. But anyway, that's it for this video. If you are interested in the overlap where sci-fi and fantasy meet psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, that's the direction most of my videos on this channel tend to go. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then go ahead and hit subscribe. But until then, catch you around.